introduce our guest today. So I have known Mark Baker now for 4 or 5 years. He was actually a professor of mine. He spent about 10 years, he and his wife, as a missionary in Honduras before being a professor at Fresno Biblical Seminary for a number of years now. Before that, he was a child of sorts and did things and had parents and lived a normal life before all those things. So he's like a real person also, just like the rest of us. But this series that we're going to enter into for the next 2 Sundays has come out of a number of years of being with Mark, learning from Mark, and having a lot of conversations of what are we actually up to as a church? How do we posture ourselves as a church? You may have heard the phrase that our behaviors are informed by our beliefs. The things that you and I believe are going to lead directly to the way that we behave. And it's our behaviors that people actually see, not necessarily our beliefs, though they're seeing our beliefs through our behaviors. And in the church, there's a lot of beliefs that inform our behaviors and how the inside of the church world relates to itself, and then how the outside world relates to the church as it looks on. And I don't know about you, but as I've learned church and experienced church and listened to people who don't do church, it can be very confusing of what church actually is and why there's so many differences. And why does it seem that this group gets harmed a lot by the church? And why does it seem like there's people on the outside and there's people on the inside? I don't know about you, but knowing where people stand can be really helpful in life. I know how to relate to people when I know where they stand. I know who to trust when I know where they stand. I know how to interact with people, who not to. But at some point, when we start to draw these lines of where people stand, it actually starts to separate people more than it actually brings them together. And so these next 2 conversations, this Sunday and next Sunday, are really kind of opening up and exposing why we kind of do some of the things we do and how we posture ourselves for some stuff. How do we continue to hold this tension that we want to extend compassion and mercy to every single person, and we also want to uphold doing good works and pressing into justice. And so how do we do these things to care for people and to continue to invite all people towards life in Jesus? And how do we not ostracize certain people or groups of people? So it's just to open that up a little bit. We're going to uncover what we're just calling the spirituality of Jesus. We want to take just a raw look at who he was and how he tended to operate. And today, Mark will tee off with just asking the question of, did he come to draw lines or did he come to erase them? And if you want to take a further step in some of Mark's work, he has 2 books here with us today. Freedom from Religiosity and Judgmentalism, and The Centered Set Church. And I would encourage you, if anything piques your interest today, to go pick these books up. And we'll also have some question and response time after a little bit of his talk. So just be thinking about some questions that might be coming up for you here along the way. But Mark, it's a really great treat to have you. We're really excited to have you. And this next 2 days actually comes out of a lot of conversations over the last year that we've had that we now get to have together. So can we welcome Mark Baker up, please?
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Great to be back with you again here. And yeah, just following up with that introduction, I think one thing I like to say is, so there's beliefs, and I think actually we're going to be thinking about these next 2 weeks is maybe things that are going on under beliefs. So you'll hear a line I'll say in a few minutes of, yeah, I had good theology, but look how it was being lived out. So with that little teaser, let's start. So yeah, back in that period when Ryan said I guess this is in the middle. My normal life was, I lived in Honduras 3 different times. So right out of college, I headed off to Honduras and then came back after a while, worked for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, if that was sort of normal life. Okay, so in Syracuse, New York. But anyways, out of college, head off to Honduras, young, and teaching at a Christian bilingual school. And in sense of my walk with Jesus, it was a time of great growth, transformation, change. I was leading a thriving youth ministry at the school I was teaching at, doing evangelism, discipleship. And I was living amongst very, very poor people, got involved just, trying to help my neighbors, reading my Bible in a different way, sensing this call to help the poor, sharing possessions with them, giving them money. And through interacting with other people around me, reading some books, I came aware of, as Christians, we're called to aid the poor, work for justice for the oppressed. This was a broader vision of Christianity than I had came to Honduras with. And I was awakened in other ways as well. I was going to a Pentecostal church, which was very different than the church I'd grown up in, and so became awakened to the work of the Spirit in a different way. And I'd moved past the legalism of my youth. You know, this sort of list of rules, do these, don't do those. Like, I sort of left that behind, wasn't using that, felt good about that. I thought that I was progressing. I was progressing. Like, it was a different version of Christianity than I'd been living just 5 or 6 years earlier. At the same time, I was very judgmental of other Christians who I look at constantly evaluating Christians' lifestyle, what they were buying, whether they were helping the poor, what they were spending their money on. And this included other missionaries. I was very critical, like, how big of a house are they? Do they have a car? Or are they using, public transport like me? Very judgmental period. And I was, I wasn't boastful. Like, I wasn't going around like, I'm the missionary that's doing it right. But I kind of felt like I was the missionary that's doing it right. And so there was, this sense of superiority, even if I wasn't, like, boastful about it. Sense of doing it right. At the same time, I was worn down by these same standards that I was using to judge other people. I mean, what is the right lifestyle, right? I'm looking at other people and saying, oh boy, I think they're spending too much. But, when the people next to you are like in abject poverty, like, what's too much? How do you decide? And I was constantly thinking about this, giving more and more away, but still, is this enough? When had I done enough? And I told you, I'm going to this Pentecostal church. It was great. I'm open to new things. But for whatever combination of reason, my experience with the Holy Spirit, like, didn't measure up to many of the others in the church. And I felt sort of on the wrong side of that line. The image, when I think back to this period, the image I have is Mark Baker. I'm walking around with these boxes. So I'd come to Honduras with this sort of sense of what Christianity is. But, I'd read a book, talk to a person, have an experience, and I'd sort of add a new box. And, like, getting this deeper, richer, like I said, I was progressing. View of what it meant to be a Christian. But I'd hear a new speaker. Listen, back in that day, this is in the 70s, 80s, listen to a cassette, and think, oh, yeah, I should do this. And but what it felt like is I'm carrying all these boxes, and I couldn't do it, and a box would fall off. I was falling short. So at the same time I'm judgmental of others, I ended up being judgmental of myself. And this is where, to the belief part, like, I was very clearly proclaiming salvation by grace. When I was doing evangelism, like, there was no doubt about that. My doctrine, my theology, in that sense, was clear. Living was something else. So I proclaimed salvation by grace, but I lived as if I was saved by works. And I was not gracious towards others, nor gracious towards myself. So where did this come from? Well, let's go back 20 or so years let's go to that was the 23, 24-year-old mark. Let's go back to 6 years old. So driving home from church one Sunday, 6 years old, northern New Jersey, it's in the back seat of the car, look out the window, and I see this man mowing his lawn. And I think, 6 years old, oh, he's not a Christian. Well, why not? Because I learned, you're not supposed to work on Sunday. And we were coming from church. He obviously hadn't been in church, not a good Christian. So I want you to feel there, 6 years old, there's little Mark, little Pharisee in the back seat of the car, right? Like, me and my family, we're doing well, right? Going to church, not working on Sunday, but this guy. So that's at 6. Now let's jump ahead. At 16, I'm going to this big high school, and it's in New York State, 3,000 people, urban thing. Anyways, and I am not drinking, smoking, dancing, swearing, cheating on tests, like most of the people around me. And again, I look at them and I think, well, they are clearly not Christians because they were doing all those things, or at least not good Christians. So where does this come from? And I want to point out again, my church had, good theology. There are some things I look back on now that I'd be a little critical of, but in a general sense, good, solid theology. And we understood, as I said, taught salvation by grace, but lived something else out. And in many ways, people in my church were loving to others, yet there was this inside out, us, them kind of feel. Good Christians, not so good Christians, or not Christians of all. And I had absorbed this sense of judgmental superiority that seemed to override the theology, the beliefs we had. And I had brought that line drawing practice from the 6-year-old, the 16-year-old. I brought that to Honduras, applied it in different ways, right? I wasn't walking around saying, are they dancing or not? But I was still drawing lines. Have you felt this pressure, this shame for falling short of being on the wrong side of a line, someone else's or maybe your own? Have you judged others or judged yourself for being on the wrong side of a line? So to better understand what I've just described, this line drawing practice of mine, we're going to take a few minutes. I'm going to explain to you some work by a man named Paul Hebert, who was a missionary and an anthropologist. And he asked the question, how do churches decide who belongs, who's part of the fellowship, who's an insider and who's an outsider? What are ways that churches do that? How do they determine who's a good Christian? So he a couple different ways. A few different ways he talked about doing this, and the first is called bounded church. And so that's a diagram we'll come back to in a second, but bounded church creates a list of essential characteristics of who's in, who is out, who belongs. And there's this static line, and okay, we'll go on to this. So the definition here, the line generally consists of correct beliefs or behaviors, but it can be lots of things. So this staticness within it that defines Christians from non-Christians, it can be political positions, it can be behaviors, it can be, are you doing the rituals correctly? And boundedness is not. You go to the next slide. Boundedness is not limited to just legalism. And I want to be very clear about this, because when we talk about this line drawing, you see that thing of, inside, outside. And I mean, when I said that 16-year-old Mike Break, you think, oh, yeah, those legalists. But here's the thing. You can be a bounded church about lots of things. And in fact, the church that I participated in that was the most bounded, where we were the most judgmental, where that line was thick, we were proudly not legalistic. This was a church in Honduras, and we all had been, like, we had come from that background, but we were like, sort of nose in the air, superior, like, oh, we're not like, we can go to the movies, not like these other, legalistic Christians. But we were just as judgmental about not being legalistic as they were with their rules. And we were judgmental in other ways. If people weren't helping the poor enough, into human rights, very bounded. So what is the character of a bounded church? So bounded churches are characterized by gracelessness, judgmentalism, conditional acceptance, shame, fear, lack of transparency, self-righteousness, and superficial ethical change. And this list here, that's things that in bounded churches is communicated to others, but also, as I tell my story, we tend in bounded churches to treat ourselves in those ways as well. So, and now here's a key point. I was never taught, growing up, they didn't stand up and say, okay, we are a bounded church, and we draw, next slide, please. We draw this line here, and this is what, it was never talked about. But I absorbed it. So, and it is, it's practiced, as I said, both corporately and individually in many churches. So what can we do? What do we do about a bounded church? Well, the problem is what? The line, right? So I've tried to make that clear. It's not one set of particular rules, or it's not helping the poor. It's the line is the problem. So what do we do with the bounded church? Solve the problem of a bounded church? Get rid of the line, right? So get rid of the line, and Paul Hebert says this is another approach. Another group is called a fuzzy church. So fuzzy church, and fuzzy church, just sort of looking at the picture communicates. So if you contrast that with a bounded picture, you get this sense of what a fuzzy church is. It doesn't have a clear communication of expectations or demands. And in a fuzzy church, next, thank you. In a fuzzy church, less attention is given to appropriate behavior or correct belief. There is less group unity and little emphasis on conversion and personal transformation. Now, and this is problematic at the group level. So when you look at the diagram, you get a sense it starts getting fuzzy. Like, well, what's the identity of the group? And over time, this group will lose its entity, tend to become more diffuse, fall apart. It's also problematic at the individual level as well. Because if you're a person in this fuzzy church seeking to follow Jesus, what is the spirituality of Jesus? It's not clear. There's little emphasis on conversion or personal transformation. And so, you're sort of on your own trying to figure things out, because the key thing of fuzzy church is just being nice, not making people feel bad. But sometimes, we need help. We need someone to say, hey, you're on the wrong track. So, takes care of the problems of the bounded group. In a fuzzy church, you won't feel shamed or judged, but you also won't feel fully loved. So, is there another option? Bounded, fuzzy. So Paul Hebert says, let's look at Jesus. Can we find another option? So let's do that. Look at Jesus for a moment. And we're going to look at a parable Jesus tells in Luke chapter 18. And this first sentence is so powerful. And I hadn't, just noticed how much this applied to these stories I told. So what does it say here? Jesus told this parable to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else. So you look at that sentence there, who is Jesus talking to? He was talking to Mark Baker, right? 6:16-24. That's someone confident of his own righteousness looking down on everyone else. So here's the parable, telling this to line drawers like me. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give 1/10 of all I get. Now, if Jesus was using a bounded approach, where would the Pharisee be? Next slide, please. He's inside, right? You look at that list of stuff, like he is in a good position in relation to the standard. He is inside. And the tax collector? Outside. So the tax collector, this one way down here in the bottom, right? Like he's way out. Okay, but let's continue with the parable Jesus is telling. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. So, stood at a distance. Like that phrase there communicates. In relation to a bounded church, he is out, distant from the line. But what does Jesus say? The next verse, I tell you that this man, the tax collector, rather than the other, the Pharisee, went home justified before God. Justified, included, part of. So let's make a few observations about this. First observation, Jesus is not fuzzy, right? He doesn't say, hey, different ways for different people, let's just all try and be nice, get along. See, there's a clear sense here. The one is justified, the other is not. But that raises a question. How can Jesus say that the tax collector, not the one who is abiding by all the expectations, is the one who's justified, included in? It's because Jesus is evaluating in a very different way than a bounded church does. So a bounded church looks at one's position in relation to the line. And if we do that, then the Pharisee is in. He's in good position in relation to the standards. Jesus is looking at direction. He's looking at trajectory. Which direction are they heading? And the tax collector is distant in relation to the standard, but what direction is he heading? He's saying, Lord, I repent. Forgive me. I need help. So Jesus looks at direction rather than position. Looks at what direction we are facing. Hebert describes this as a centered church. And this is a totally different paradigm. So bounded and fuzzy are on the same continuum at different extremes. But a centered church, it's a whole different way. It's still a group thing. You're looking at who belongs and who doesn't. But what you look at is direction, orientation. So here's a quick definition. A centered church has a directional and relational basis of evaluation. A shared center unifies the group, and belonging is determined by observing a person's relationship to the center, God. The group is made up of all the people moving toward the center. Those in the church do not have the same characteristics, but are headed in the same direction. So if we look at the diagram again, the people whose arrows are headed toward the center, that shows their orientation, their trajectory, they are part, they belong, they're in the group. And the ones whose arrows are heading the other way are not. And so they're in different places. They're not uniform, but those who are in are all heading the same direction. So a centered church, rather than drawing a line and saying, okay, where's your position right from the line? The centered church asked, has the person changed direction? Have they repented? Is there loyalty and devotion to Jesus? A centered church has Jesus at its center, and it follows the way of Jesus. It looks at trajectory, where someone is heading rather than do they measure up to the standard. So in a moment, I'm going to stop and let you ask some questions of clarification, but let me anticipate questions. So I'm going to answer two questions that people commonly ask. So the first of all is, so I've been being very critical, negative of this term bounded church, right? So I want to clarify right away. Boundaries are not bad things. We need boundaries in life. So just to have a boundary doesn't make you a bounded church. It's how the boundaries are used. You see lots of boundaries in the Bible between appropriate and inappropriate behavior, appropriate and inappropriate beliefs. But a bounded church uses the boundary line as a way of judging, a way of putting some in and others out, above and out. So first of all, just to say, oh, we have a boundary doesn't mean, oh, you're a bounded church. It's how you use that boundary line. The other is, and that's related to this first, is that a centered approach doesn't reject all use of rules, guidelines, laws. It uses them very differently. And again, we look to Jesus. So Jesus, he said, I didn't come to abolish the law. But Jesus was very critical of the use of law as an indication of status. Right back to Luke 18. That Pharisee was using the law as a way of saying, I'm up, they're down. And Jesus was strongly against that bounded use, but there's a difference. In a centered church, rules, guidelines. I like the word guidelines, because what's a guideline do? It guides you. So we have rules, laws, principles that guide us toward the center. So they're used to guide us, help us in our spirituality with Jesus. Okay, so before I make a bit of reflection on applying this to us and sharing one more example, let's take a few minutes, and you can ask some questions about these different paradigms that Paul Hebert presented, how they relate to my story. So,
Thank
questions
you,
or
Mark.
clarifications.
I'll walk around with the mic. I'll hold it in front of your face awkwardly. Don't try and grab it. I won't let go. I'm going to start with one question. I mean, even as thinking through sociologists study culture, and we have so much of culture operating one way and different cultures operating in different ways, and even cultural contexts change over times. How much does a centered church also need to almost move towards maybe a cultural way of being to be positioned to actually receive and connect with others?
So yeah, I guess something I'd say is, I think a centered church opens up the possibility of being radically welcoming, because it doesn't have to be uptight about some people coming in who don't look the part of a Christians, who don't have their act together yet, because it doesn't threaten their identity. But at the same time, just when you started talking, Ryan, I think, look at culture today, and we're in a very, strange cultural moment. I think 10 years ago, if you'd asked me about culture and bounded and fuzzy, I said, wow, we live in a really fuzzy culture. Tolerance is supreme virtue. And so a certain way, I would say a centered church needs to have some resistance to that kind of culture. But we live in a very polarized, line-drawing society. So we're in this interesting mix of sort of tolerance as supreme virtue at one level, and yet on the other hand, very line-drawing, judgmental, good, bad. So I think there's ways that a centered church allows the possibility of being radically welcoming, but at the same time, I think also discerning in what we're allowing in from culture, of presenting something different, but doing that in a way, different than bounded or fuzzy options.
So go ahead and raise your hand, then also if you text in, I do have those. First question from somebody else.
I won't take it. Okay. I'm used to holding microphones. So my question actually has to do with the last slide that was about the clarifications. And you talk about using guidelines to aid in transformation and to help change direction. But I feel like we've all probably seen people in the churches say, it's my responsibility to change your direction, to guide you in your transformation according to what I think that should look like. So where do you see that kind of individual, I'm focused on my own direction and where I'm going, but also guiding other people, but not letting it be about you and your standards?
Well, so I think one thing is, I think a centered approach opens up the possibility of love guiding, but it doesn't make it automatic, right? So, and we'll talk more about this next week. We can draw these diagrams and say, okay, we're going to be centered, and that doesn't make it automatically happen. So there's a lot of question of who is the God at the center, and then what's the character of a centered approach. And so, I have a chapter in the book where I talk about character of the centered approach, and curiosity, compassion, love, creativity. And so in walking with others, I think just because we say, we're going to be centered, we use these arrows direction, doesn't automatically mean we're going to be loving. But it opens up the possibility for it in a way I think bounded or fuzzy doesn't. And I guess the first thing I thought when you're saying is, well, let's do this together, not just me telling you how to live, but us as a group walking with each other. So before I talk to you, I talk to someone else and say, yeah, I've noticed this. What do you think? What is it? What's the loving thing for her? Thank you.
And I'll walk to another hand. And then how do you communicate a boundary that has been crossed while still being compassionate, encouraging / welcoming to others?
Yeah, that is more than a 1-minute response. So, there's
okay, fine, 15 seconds.
So the first thing I'd say, when I wrote this book on Centered Set Church, I pictured it as, what I'll do is I'll have these case studies, and we'll have some situation. Person is doing X, how do you respond to that in a centered way? And when I went out and talked to people trying to do it, I quickly realized there is no centered way to respond. There's not one centered way to respond to a thing. So there's 2 chapters in my book of various stories of people answering that question of responding. And it's different in each case because again, you're not focused on the boundary line. You're not just focused on a particular behavior. You're asking, well, why the behavior? So maybe that's maybe the 15-second answer is, well, at first, in a centered approach, you ask why questions, not just, hey, you're doing this wrong, stop. The focus is on the person, not the line. You're not defending the line.
Another hand raise. Anybody want it? There we go.
I feel like what I see in most of the churches that I've attended is not people moving away from the center or towards it, but just staying stagnant.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so in your diagram, obviously, there's arrows going away,
Right.
Towards
Right.
or away. But how do you address just the complacency of not moving anywhere, right, in a centered church?
Okay, so one, and these paradigms are really powerful. So a bounded church and fuzzy church both lend themselves to complacency. Because a bounded church, when are you good? When you're inside the line, right? So I was whatever church I was in and bounded, as long as I do the thing, then I'm good. So the first thing I'd say is the centered church, by the character of it itself, is powerful. And a centered church will have more of a spirit of, let's walk towards the center. Let's get closer. Because it's not like, oh, I'm across the line, I'm good. So that's the first thing. And then the other thing I'd say is, okay, in a bounded church too, there's a tendency to put emphasis on things that are achievable and measurable, because they need to be for you to be in and be good. Whereas I think a centered church can take on the challenge of things that I can't easily say this week, I did it, but we're working on it. So I think a centered church has the potential of having more conversation and talk about how are we moving towards Jesus. In talking to, thinking in relation to your question, 2 different churches, one in Ontario and another in Washington State, and they build into their liturgy, their weekly processes of what's your next step. So imagine if you're in a church where they're constantly talking about what's your next step, then it communicates that sense of, well, keep walking. So.
If you're wondering what your next step is, the Welcome to Midtown lunch is next Sunday. There's tacos right after. So, and buy the book. That's another next step. Good.
Very good.
So I'd be curious. I'm sitting here. I didn't grow up in church. Faith is just something that maybe I wasn't aware of how much it influenced my life, or I was resistant to it. But now I'm here, and I've given my life to Jesus. I'm exploring Jesus. I have big questions. Why does this centered approach matter, even when I'm thinking about life with Jesus as maybe a new person? Yeah,
and this is a bit to a step pointing towards next week, and the next 5 minutes too. But I would say to all of you, you are blessed, privileged to be in a church that is trying to be centered. So in one sense, if you're in the category that Ryan was just talking about, I don't think you have to worry about, okay, well, I've got to work to make this church center. I mean, join in being part of that. But there's another question is, how do I walk in a centered way? And so that's why I started this with the stories I started with today, because Ryan asked me that question. He said, okay, Mark, well, what's it mean for individuals to do a centered approach? So we're not just thinking, okay, how can we be a centered church, but how do I? And yeah, I said, well, we're going to talk about that the next 5 minutes and next week. So I would invite you, if you're in the category that Ryan was talking about, I would hope this would enable you to feel a bit relaxed, like, oh, okay, this is about heading towards Jesus, walking, and let's keep doing that. And I would say the very, very key thing, and we'll talk more about this next week, is who is the God of the center? We just kind of zoom past that, like I said, well, God's the center, but how do you think about God? So if, again, for the type of person that Ryan just asked, I would encourage you to think, well, what's that, the God in the center? What's that God look like for you? Let's talk about that.
Maybe one more hand, and then we're going to Mark wrap us up.
I have been to many churches throughout my life where they are Christ-centered, but there is also a very strong line, and it doesn't start out that way, but the line gradually grows. Mm-hmm. And so I want to know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, so two thoughts. One is, and this goes back to the same beginning, like beliefs, articulated beliefs are not enough. So lots of churches could say we're Christ-centered, but if you have the character of line drawing, ask it this way. If you're in a bounded church, where's your security? It's in the line. So I say, we're Christ-centered, but I know my security is in that line. That's why people think I'm a good Christian. And it just pulls me towards focusing on the line. So, good words, Christ-centered, but I think to truly be Christ-centered means intentional work to not be bounded. And this is what I'd say. I think line drawing comes naturally to us. The status seeking comes naturally to us. It got Jesus killed, right? Like he attacked line drawing and it got him killed. So language is not enough. Just putting up this diagram is not enough. This is something we need to work at with intentionality. And what I would say is, I feel like, hey, like I'm not that, same 24, 16, 6-year-old. Like I'm not like that now. But in another way, that's still within me. And so I think a key thing is to continually refresh myself in the gospel of Jesus Christ and say, no, it is not drawing lines, Mark. Thank you. Good question.
I'm going to invite the worship team up, and then Mark is going to close us with a practice here. Can we at least just thank him real quick, though, for the question and response? And then as they prepare, is there anyone that was like, oh, I'd love to buy that book but wasn't going to? If you're already going to buy it, don't take this from me, but was anyone on the fence and wants a book? Is there anybody? There you go. You can pick one. Which one?
Okay.
Oh, man. Last one. Done.
Thank you. Great questions. Feel free to ask me more afterwards. I could have talked for 20 minutes about any one of them. My classes are usually 3 hours long, so I'm not so practiced at this half an hour deal. Okay, so and I was kind of alluding to this. The central question of this week and next is, how do I follow Jesus in a centered way rather than bounded or fuzzy? And so to think back to my story, I practice line drawing not just towards others, but also towards myself. And so that's what I'm inviting us in these next 5 minutes and then next week to think about is, are there ways that you have practiced line drawing not just towards others, but towards yourself? And then on the other hand, too, some of us have, that line drawing, we're done with it, and maybe you're in a fuzzy space towards yourself. So I'm going to end with an image, a metaphor, and this borrowing from someone else who's from Australia, Al Hirsch. And so in the Australian outback, they have huge ranches. And because, it's very dry. So, for the cows to have enough to eat, they have to have these huge ranches. So then there's the question, though, of how do you keep the cows on your ranch? So one option would be to build fences. But because of the immense size of these ranches, the fences would be very expensive to build and expensive to maintain. So what do ranchers do? Instead of building fences in the Australia outback, they dig wells. And what happens? So you have this immense land, but if you dig a well in the middle, the cows will only wander so far because they need water, and they will come back to the well. So the ranchers dig wells. So then let us, rather than building fences, let us dig a deep well that is fed by the life-giving water of Jesus. Now, unfortunately, many churches and many Christians have opted for fence building and fence maintenance rather than well digging. If you have been wounded, shamed by lines drawn by others, come to the well. Jesus does not draw shaming lines. Drink deeply of the love of Jesus. Let the water of this Jesus well wash away the shame. I invite you, close your eyes for a moment. And imagine Jesus saying to you, all right, so close eyes. Imagine Jesus before you saying to you, I am not a fence builder. I look at direction, orientation. Which way are you headed? Imagine Jesus saying to you, I celebrate and honor your turning to me. I celebrate and honor each step you take toward me. Let's take this moment and soak in this loving acceptance of Jesus. Jesus with eraser in hand. Okay, you can open your eyes. Now there we were talking about what? You feeling shame because of, having been on the wrong side of someone else's line. But there's also how are we treating ourselves? How are you approaching your own walk with Jesus? So I urge you, rather than focusing on fences in your life of discipleship, do well work. And there's two ways to focus on fences. One is to maintain them, build them. The other is tear them down, but that's all you're thinking about is get rid of the fences, get rid of the fences. And both of those, bounded or fuzzy, can be problematic. So rather than maintaining a focus on maintaining strong fences or trying to get rid of them, I invite you, do well work. Do well work. Leave the fences or leave the wandering in fuzzy terrain and do well work. Let's turn away and rather than building them or tearing them down, focus on the well, Jesus. What might that mean for you? To focus on the well. What might it mean for you to focus on Jesus? What might be well work that the Spirit is calling you to? Let's take a moment and listen. So this week, I had to give the bulk of the time giving my introductory stories and then explaining these concepts. And next week, I'll do a little review at the beginning of the concepts, and then we're going to focus in on this question of how do I follow Jesus in a centered way rather than bound and fuzzy. So that's what we'll work about with next week. I look forward to it. I want to say just a word about the two books. So they're both very, very much on what we talked about this morning of bound and fuzzy and centered. But the difference is the one, Freedom from Religiosity, it's a commentary, a study on Galatians, written at lay level. They told me no footnotes allowed in the book. I think there's two. But if you want sort of a biblical basis, okay, well, these are nice concepts, but this is, well, that's a good book for doing that. And then the other one is more description, and then, as I alluded to, a lot on how to live this out. Thank you. Look forward to being with you again next week.
Why don't we stand together?